So could you just tell me what your role is at Seed Psychology, what your title is on?
So I'm a sport and exercise psychologist, work within the realms of sport and exercise, but mostly sport and performance-based issues. And Seed Psychology is my company, so I founded it a couple of years ago, but I do some consultancy work for other teams and individuals.
How many people do you have working at Seed Psychology? Or is it?
Just me, and in the future possibly to contract out some consultancy work.
Did that help having a title for whether it was, if you'd have just gone as just Betsy, do you think it would make any difference if you weren't Seed Psychology, if that makes sense?
Probably not. One of the biggest pieces of advice I got when I set up my company was to set up a shell company, because that's the way I'll probably work years down the line. And someone said to me, don't put it in your name, because if you get married, your surname will change and then you might lose the branding effect of your name. So that's the main reason I thought I'll go for a company name. And Seed Psychology was founded on the base of the idea of growing a seed, basically. So the fact that a seed is planted and I will help the client or the team to grow their seed and how to look after their seed, and they will go on and kind of take it on from there. So it kind of came about through that, really, the name.
Right. So you're mainly performance-based, that's right, isn't it?
Yes.
So this is quite a broad question, but would you be able to give me a few examples of what you would do for a certain client, for example?
Okay, yeah, so a lot of the work I do is in football, and I work with a team, mainly youth teams at this time in my career, and I will look at performance-based issues on a one-to-one basis, but also as a team, so whether there's team cohesion issues, communication, any kind of, what's the phrase? Sorry.
Sorry?
Career transition, work a lot through career transition, especially with youth athletes that are in academy setups, whether they go on to progress to first team professionals or whether they drop out of the sport altogether, and how they cope with that. So
do they, would a client come to you with a problem, or are you just trying to help them get to that next level almost in a mental way?
It could be problem based, so I have more individual clients will approach me with specific issues, so it might be like a return from injury or lacking confidence or a dip in performance, or any kind of relationship issues, so it might be a team cohesion issue that they're struggling with, or a coach interaction, so they might have a really specific thing they want to work on, or it might be like a more general thing. So some athletes or teams will just want to work on super strength, so they might not have a perceived weakness that they think they need to work on, but they might want to just ever improve their confidence, as most athletes do. So yeah, it could be working on something specific and intervention based, or it could be something a bit broader and more educational from my point of view, so giving athletes the opportunity to learn about how best they can make their mind work for them performance wise.
So if a player was to come to you and they've just had a big layoff through injury, and they think they're struggling with confidence, or they don't know what to do, what would you give them advice, or would you do certain things with them that you'd hope that improves their confidence?
Firstly, my job would be to understand what they're really thinking at that moment, so what the injury means for them. So if they've suffered a long-term injury or a career-threatening injury perhaps, I'll try and understand what their psychology is at that moment in time. So is it fear of re-injury when they return to the sport? Is it fear of not returning to the sport? Is it depression issues through not being able to train or perform? So I'll kind of diagnose from that point of view first of all, and then obviously what my approach would depend on that. So worked with a few athletes that have got fear of re-injury. So whether it's the specific move that they were doing when they became injured, that's quite a common one. So if it's a certain type of movement pattern that caused the injury, they will be pretty apprehensive about doing that movement pattern in training or in competition again. So I might use imagery techniques for that kind of treatment. So trying to get them to successfully visualise a successful performance of that movement without injury, and establishing the brain patterns and thought processes relating to successful performance will help to eradicate that fear of re-injury. So it could be something like that.
So if a person came to you with, they just had a long day off through injury, and I think a lot of people, that they'll suffer through their mental health if they have a big layoff.
Yeah.
Because they're not doing what they love in their career. If that was to happen, so someone suffering with depression through it, how would you deal with that? Would you give that? Would you I don't know what the word is, but would you say to them to go to someone else, or would you try and deal with that as much as you can and then
I think
go on?
I'm very much performance based, so obviously psychology is a pretty broad topic. If it enters the realms of being a clinical issue, so if I was working with an athlete and they were depressed in a really broad sense, so they were struggling with returning to sport, or the fact that they weren't able to return to sport, then I would deal with that on kind of a superficial level. If I had concerns that was really deep rooted and was actually affecting their mental health on a much deeper level, then I would look to refer that to a clinical psychologist who would deal specifically with mental health issues. But there's ways that I can work within that, but if I had concerns that there was a really underlying health issue, that's beyond my capabilities, so I would refer that on to a clinical practitioner.
So would you try and combat it with your performance based? So if it was something you felt you could deal with,
yeah,
would you just try and not ignore it in a sense, but try and deal with it in other ways, I assume?
Yeah, initially definitely. I'd look at it firstly as a cause and effect kind of relationship. So is the lack of activity or the injury the cause of the low mood, if you like, rather than depression, depending on whether it's a clinical thing? And what can I do to assist that athlete in kind of coming out of that low mood? So I would definitely deal with that on that kind of basis. But if it became any more deep-rooted and it was entering other areas of their lives, I think with an athlete it's quite easy to tell whether they're affected by low mood or a depression that's purely sport-related, and therefore it's not necessarily really a clinical issue. So I would definitely work with an athlete on that basis, but if I thought it was entering all realms of their life and they were not really coping with daily life because of this issue, then that's beyond my capability, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So would you ever... Because it's quite a big thing with this whole mental health thing. We've seen a big increase in the number of athletes who've come out and spoken about it.
Yeah.
Aaron Lennon and Andrew Flintoff.
Yeah.
Number of big stars. Would it ever be something that you would, I don't know, but would consider learning more about so that you could deal with more?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a strong link between someone like me who's a sports performance-based psychologist and a clinical psychologist, and how I can understand the performance side of their issues, and a clinical psychologist can really understand what's going on in the brain in terms of a clinical depression. So I think there's an opportunity for me to link with clinical psychologists in the future in relation to mental health in sport, definitely. I think it's understanding what's happened to an athlete and why they might have developed depression is important, and the athletes that you mentioned there, particularly Andrew Flintoff, athletes like that, you wonder whether their depression has stemmed from really having nothing else in their life, and that sport's kind of taken over that. You hear some ex-athletes talk about that kind of thing when they've retired, and how successful transition tends to be for the athletes that have set something up prior to their retirement, but early retirement and injury and unexpected end of careers are not always conducive to that. So yeah, I think there's definitely a link for me to work with clinical psychologists in the future.
Obviously it isn't your field almost, but would you say that there's quite a few causes? That when I was filming this documentary, I found that there's not just one cause of a mental health issue for an athlete. What are the main causes you come across that someone's for the reason why someone's struggling with, say, depression or anxiety, that kind of thing?
I think injury is a massive one. Injury and deselection. So whether that's deselection in terms of they've been dropped for a couple of games, or dropped from a squad if they're an individual athlete, or deselection entirely, so being dropped from a football academy, for instance. I think injury and deselection are probably the biggest two that I've come across for any kind of mental health issues. But then I think there's probably athletes out there, more high profile athletes, that perhaps the outer eye would say that there's nothing for them to be depressed about. That's a common phrase you hear, isn't it? That people say, what have they got to be depressed about? They've got loads of money and they've got this and that, but maybe the balance in their life and their life as a whole, I think we forget they're human beings. They're not just full-time athletes that don't do anything else. So yeah, does that link to your question?
That was a really good question. Very good, because that links perfectly to what I've said throughout the whole thing.
Yeah.
Would you say that governing bodies in sport or specific clubs, do you think they could do more to help, say, the youngsters that are hoping to go into this sporting life, essentially, and also maybe the athletes coming to the end of their career? Do you think governing bodies and clubs could help them more with it and put stuff in place for the mental health?
Yes, although from my experience working in a football academy, and I work in a Category 3 academy, which doesn't have the degree of funding that a Category 1 Premier League side might have. But certainly what they do with their athletes is admirable in terms of teaching their young athletes how to deal with career transition, and the fact that these 15, 16-year-olds think that they're all going to be professional footballers. In reality, maybe one of them will be, maybe two. Certainly at high league level, some of them might make it at Southern Prem or something, but I think there is quite a lot done in clubs, to my knowledge at the moment, certainly with the FA, that they are teaching kids how to deal with career transition, how to deal with media as well, if they do make it kind of to the big time, if you like, how to deal with the media pressures and the kind of reaction they might get from fans and stuff like that. So I think there is some stuff being done. I think I read an article recently about athletes at the older end of the spectrum who might go through some kind of training about, okay, what are you going to do next? Your career's coming to an end. You're maybe Wayne Rooney, for instance. It won't be too many more years when he has to think about what is he going to do next. And actually them setting up a plan that's quite difficult for a person of a relatively young age that's having to think about retirement. But I think there is stuff being done. I don't know about governing bodies of many other sports and how that's handled, but I think there is some good work being done, certainly in football academies, to help young athletes, not just in football. I think there is quite a broad line of help.
Yeah, because I think a big problem is that, well, not necessarily a problem, but we don't really hear about any of it, because you don't hear about the stuff the FA is putting on, or say the England athletics. Just sort of a move on question, just about you. What was your inspiration? Why did you want to go into psychology and sports psychology in specific?
I've always been incredibly sporty myself, so I think from a very young age I always wanted to work within sport. My inspiration actually was really specific. So I used to watch, I never had anything to do with tennis, but I always used to watch Wimbledon every year. And I used to watch, probably a bit young for you, Leighton Hewitt. And I used to think, what is it about this guy that's different from everybody else? And he comes up against other oppositions before he was Wimbledon champion. And why does he beat these people that in theory he shouldn't beat? And then I started looking at, like the FA Cup. I'm a big football fan anyway. And you think, why do these small teams beat big teams? And this shouldn't happen. This isn't all about ability and sporting talent and fitness and physiological aspects. There's something else going on here. So I think as soon as I realised that in sport and how important the mind is in terms of everything else, it's almost the cutting edge. And yeah, that's the reason I always wanted to work in psychology and kind of help from a different angle and to maybe see